Good afternoon. I'm Cecilia Rouse, and I'm Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, and it's such a pleasure to welcome Anne-Marie Slaughter back to the school. Anne-Marie is President and CEO of New America, the Bert G. Kurtstetter Class of '66 University Professor Emerita of Politics and International Affairs here at Princeton, and the former Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School. And she's also a graduate of the great class of 1980. A foreign policy analyst, academic, and public commentator, Slaughter has been described as an innovative and prolific scholar by Foreign Policy magazine and was named one of the magazine's top 100 global thinkers 4 years in a row. In 2009, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton appointed her as Director of Policy Planning for the U.S. State Department. She was the first woman to hold that position and remained there until February of 2011. It was this experience that served as the springboard for Slaughter's 2012 article in The Atlantic, Why Women Still Can't Have It All. The article, which quickly became one of the magazine's most read articles in its history, discusses Slaughter's decision to leave a dream job in Washington to return to her family and academic career and the obstacles women face in the workplace. This article also became the centerpiece of renewed national debate about equality between men and women in the workplace. Today, Anne-Marie will discuss her new book, Unfinished Business, Women, Men, Work, Family. The book discusses how shifts in work culture, public policy, and social mores can allow men and women alike to have fulfilling careers along with the rewards of family life. Former Google executive Eric Schmidt states, Unfinished Business sets out a powerful vision not only for gender equality, but for the future of work. Hillary Rodham Clinton writes, Anne-Marie Slaughter insists that we ask ourselves hard questions. After reading Unfinished Business, I'm confident you will be left with Anne-Marie's hope and optimism that we can change our points of view and policies so that both men and women can fully participate in their families and use their full talents on the job. Melinda Gates writes, Unfinished Business is an important read for women and men alike. Slaughter shows us that when people share equally the responsibility of caring for others, they are healthier, economies prosper, and both women and men are freer to lead the lives they want. So I should mention that following today's discussion, you'll want to come and to the book signing and sale that we'll have in Schultz. But before we do that, please join me in welcoming Anne-Marie Slaughter.
Thank you. Thank you, and it's wonderful to see all of you and the people downstairs and on the webcast. This is a wonderful place for me to give this talk because I've been in this room many times before. So when I first sat in this room, it was the fall of 1977, and I was studying international relations in Politics 240. Of course, my husband now teaches many years later. And I was a sophomore, and I was very certain that I wanted both to study law and to do foreign policy. So I would have been about 20 years old. I certainly thought of myself as a feminist. If you'd asked me, I'd have said that's part of my identity. I would have said I'm really lucky that I was born in the late 1950s and not the 30s like my mother or the 1900s like my grandmothers. I have had the great good fortune to be born at a time when the opportunities that have historically been open to men are now open to women. And I am part of that movement. I was aware then that the women 10 years ahead of me were the real pioneers, but I certainly was, as I said, both grateful and proud to be a feminist. I don't think I thought very much about family at all. I certainly wasn't thinking about children. I think if you'd asked me, I'd have said, yes, I want children in some vague way. After I want to get into law school and be a lawyer and start a foreign policy career, all of that. So that's when I was first sitting, when all of you were. Next time I came to this room would have been roughly 2002, when I was named dean under the great President Shirley Tillman, whom I'm truly thrilled to see sitting in the front row. And if you'd asked me then, about work and family, I would have said, yes, family's very much on my mind. I had a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I had spent quite a lot of my late 30s trying to have them. And I was very thrilled to be a mom. I still would have said to you, although I would have spoken only to the women in this audience, I'd have said, you can do this. Absolutely, you can do this. It's really just a question of wanting your career enough and just making it work. I didn't think deeply about what it took. I knew that as a tenured professor and with a husband as a tenured professor who lived about a half mile from here and their school was another half mile in the other direction, that made it a lot easier. But I essentially thought it was up to you as to whether or not you, again being a woman, whether or not you could put work and family together. The third time that I stood at this podium 3 years ago was after my article came out in The Atlantic, Why Women Still Can't Have It All, a title that I wanted to be Why Women Can't Have It All, ... yet, which probably would have been understood quite differently. It certainly wouldn't have been understood as my arguing the women can't have it all. But I was here and I gave a talk on that article, and at that point, I thought, this is much harder than I ever thought it was. It has been possible for me only because I have had money, a lead parent, and an extraordinarily flexible career. And the minute that changed, above all the very flexible career, the minute I had to work for someone else, even a fabulous boss, Secretary Clinton did everything she could to make things work for me. But my work was in one place and my family was in another, and events entirely beyond my control, e.g. my son's adolescence, which in the greater scheme of things was not that rocky, but it was rocky enough to mean that both my husband and I felt we had to be home and focused on him. That meant I had to choose. So what I had said before that, telling countless women, all my students, lots of women after audiences, no, you don't have to choose. It's fine. You can make it work. You just have to want it enough. I thought that's not true. I had to choose, and it's not because I'm not ambitious. I'm plenty ambitious. It's because things happened that were beyond my control. And once I saw that, which many people thought should have been obvious, but nevertheless, once that message sort of hit home for me, I then thought, this conversation has got to get a lot more complicated, and we need to be focused on all the changes that the workplace has to make and society has to make for women to be able to have what men have traditionally had, which is a career and a family too. So that was 2012, again in this room. 3 years on, I want to tell you what I think now, and it is actually quite different than certainly what I thought at 20 or in my early 40s or even 3 years ago. And I want to start by telling you how I see my own family. My father, actually, I don't think he sat in this room, but he was a Wilson School major. And all my life, as I said, I looked at my father and he was a lawyer, and I thought, I want to be a lawyer and I want to be a foreign policy person. And if you'd asked me about my mother, I would have told you she was a wonderful artist, and she is a wonderful artist. I'd have told you about her paintings, her sculptures. I'd have said she had a 40-year retrospective, and she has paintings and collections up and down the East Coast and in Europe. I'd have been very careful to emphasize her professional credentials. I would not have told you that she was a homemaker or a housewife or a stay-at-home mom or any of those adjectives for most of my growing up. I would not have thought that was something that reflected particularly well on her in terms of introducing her to you. But I'd have said, my father's a lawyer and my mother's an artist. Over the last 3 years, talking to lots and lots of people and reading lots of things and thinking really hard, I look at my parents, and they're both in their 80s now, and they're both still working. And I think my father's had a wonderful career as a lawyer, and he was in government in the Carter administration. And I think my mother's art is fabulous. But I look at my mother's other work, I look at myself and my 2 brothers and our spouses and the 8 grandchildren and the ways in which we are each other's foundation, the ways in which, it's a family grapevine that the minute anything happens, a homesick kid at college, somebody having a reverse, somebody really feeling badly and needing support, and the family kicks into action. And we are there, we are each other's foundation. That did not just happen. As a parent myself now, I can say that doesn't just happen. It happened because of her work. It happened because of all that she invested in us, which I now think is every bit as important as the work she's done as an artist or the work my father's done as a lawyer. And I did not think that 3 years ago. So what I want to do in our time here is to talk about how that change in perspective, a focus on the work of care, on the investing in others, is related to what I think is the second half of the revolution for male-female equality. And I'm going to talk about care, I'm going to talk about men, and I'm going to talk about collective policy action, particularly appropriate for standing here. So let's start with care. Again, part of this is care work has traditionally been women's work, and women have been secondary to men, so men's work has been valued more than women's work. That's certainly a big part of the story as to why we don't particularly value care work. We're also Americans, and we are work obsessed to the point that, what's the first thing any of us ask anybody else? What do you do? What do you do? Europeans think we're really boring. They just think there's so much else. Like, couldn't you ask, what book have you read? Or what movie have you seen? Or what did you do last weekend? Or what are your hobbies? Or what are you passionate about? Any number of things. But we ask, what do you do? So part of our devaluing of care is also that this is a culture that values what you do to earn money more than just about anything else for lots of complicated reasons. But I think even more fundamentally, we are at a place in our society where we focus more on ourselves than on others. And so that what do you do is also who are you as an individual, as a goal-directed person who is accomplishing your own goals? The Virginia Woolf, person in the room of your own, if you are a woman, right? She wrote, to be a writer, you need an income and a room of your own. It's that side of all of us that we Americans, focus on particularly. And I'm all for that, right? I started by saying I'm very grateful to have been born in an era where women were allowed to pursue their goals as individuals just the way men are. That's enormously important to human well-being. But in focusing on all those investments in ourselves, we're missing the value of investing in others. And not just because it's about those others. Right? We should be valuing investing in others because investing in the next generation is essential to our survival, certainly as a race, as a nation. We now know that the first 5 years of a child's life, when you are spending your time with that child, you're not just teaching that child things. You're not just conveying knowledge. You are shaping his or her brain. You are determining what he or she will be able to learn for the rest of his or her life. As a policy person, I think that's a national security issue, a competitiveness issue, a well-being issue, and certainly an equality issue. So we can certainly think of the value of investing in others for them. And similarly, you don't have to have kids. You don't have to choose to spend time with your kids. That's your choice. You do have to have parents, still now. Shirley's a molecular biologist. Maybe she'll tell us at some point we won't need parents, but right now, we still need parents. And you owe a debt to those people who cared for you. And when I say I here, I'm the height of the baby boom. So the more people were born in 1958 than any other year of the baby boom. As we age, the baby boom ages, this becomes a huge national issue again. So we need to value care for elders as well as care for children and care for the ill and the disabled, any of those we love. But the piece that I think was missing from this debate, and that was at least new to me, is how much care is valuable for ourselves. That when you invest in others, it's not just about them, it's about you. Now, this is a university, and any faculty member will tell you, yes, when I invest in my students, I grow and I learn. This kind of hit home for me when I read a small book by a philosopher that was sent to me. It was called On Caring, written in the early 1970s by a man about caring from a philosophical point of view, never heard of work-life balance, and talked about all the ways in which investing in others teaches patience, teaches restraint, teaches that ability to give, but also to step back and let someone else flourish, which is the hardest thing about parenting. It's you got to teach, you got to give, but you also have to step back and let a toddler fall down and let a teenager drive off with your car, and all of those things in between. So part of what we're missing by not valuing care, we're not valuing what we ought to be valuing as a society, as human beings who need to create webs of care that support us, but we're also not valuing it enough for ourselves. Last piece about care is that when we focus just on women, we almost invariably, I say almost because there's certainly plenty of people and many people on this faculty who are exceptions, but we almost invariably focus on numbers. And that in turn leads us to focus on the women at the top. The measure that comes most readily to mind if you just say, let's look at the progress of women since 1961, somebody will raise, how many women are there in the Fortune 500? The answer is somewhere 28 or 29. Dismally low if you think it should be around 250. Or we say, how many women university presidents are there? How many women politicians are there? How many women senators? How many women surgeons or tenured professors? Those numbers are hugely important, but we miss how many women there are at the bottom. I call it in the book an unlovely symmetry, that there are too few women at the top and far too many at the bottom. The majority of the poorest people in our society are overwhelmingly single mothers. The majority of minimum wage workers are women. 2/3 of shift workers are women. The reason we have too many women at the bottom is the same reason we have too few at the top, although in a different manifestation and with far graver consequences, which is we do not value care. We do not support caregiving. We expect women who have children or who are caring for their extended family members or their own parents, we expect them to work, but we do not support their care. We do not have paid leave. We do not have elder care and affordable child care available. We do not offer ways that allow them, as a public policy matter, to take care of those they love and to earn a living. So the focus on care, I think, opens us up to conversations that we ought to be having about the value of care for our children, for our elders, for our society as a whole, about what it does for all of us, women and men, and it focuses us on all women and not simply the numbers of women at the top. After a month of book tour, my poor voice is... So now let me talk about men. And again, even in 2012, when my Atlantic article came out, it was aimed at women. It was very clearly aimed at women. The title was Why Women Still Can't Have It All. And certainly all the examples, it was aimed at women. This book has men in the title, and it is aimed as much at men as it is at women. Even though I don't necessarily think men will be the primary audience, I think that's a defect of the way the debate is currently being had. And my dear hope is that the women who buy it and read it will then hand it to the men in their lives, and that it is equally as important for men as well as for women. My thinking changed a lot about men because of the number of men who wrote to me. Men who wrote to me and said, you think I have it all. You think I have the balance of work and family that I want, but I am just as much a prisoner of gender roles as women were 20 or 30 years ago. I would much rather be far more engaged in my family. I would much rather be able to be at home as much as my wife is, or my partner, or my husband, depending on the couple. I have to be the breadwinner. I don't have a choice. That is my role. I am expected to be the breadwinner. And if I try to do what working mothers do, if I try to take paternity leave, if I try to work part-time, if I ask for a flexible schedule, not only will I be stigmatized for not being sufficiently committed to my career, my masculinity will be called into question. It is even harder for me to have that kind of balance because I am still the prisoner of very set gender roles. And I have to say, I looked at our own sons about a year and a half ago, and I realized, wow, here I am. I've written this article. I'm touring the country talking about equality, raising my sons more or less the way my father was raised in the 1930s, or certainly in the 1940s, or certainly the way my brothers were raised in the 1960s. If I had a daughter, I would be raising her to believe that she could combine work and family, care and competition in any measure she chose. But I'm still expecting my sons to be breadwinners. I am not giving them the option of being lead parent in the same way I would certainly tell my daughter she could be lead parent if that's what she chose, or if as she pursued her career. We are not giving men the same range of choices we are giving women. Now, many of you are thinking, yeah, of course we're not. They don't want those choices. Well, one guy wrote to me and he said, I know you're reading this letter and you're thinking, well, most men are very happy with their lot. He said, well, that's what men thought about women back in the 1950s and 1960s. Men were very convinced that women didn't want to work, that women liked being at home, that the workplace was rough and tumble and competitive, and women were nurturing by nature and did not want to be competitive. Well, I think we've proved that wrong, right? I mean, women may be nurturing, they may be competitive, there's some combination. Every individual woman is some combination of the two. So if that's true for women, why isn't that equally true for men? We'll only know when we give men a free range of choices, when we value them for being caring beings just as much as being competitive beings, and when we let them speak for what they want in the same way women demanded what we wanted. And I will say here, there's a great deal about he for she and how men can advance women by standing for women. And that is hugely important. Bob Cohan is there on the left with Nan Cohan, both of whom feature in my book and both of whom have been role models. And Bob is certainly somebody who stood for women throughout his career. That's hugely important. I wouldn't be where I am without the male mentors in my life, but that's not what I'm asking for. I'm asking for men to stand for themselves. I'm saying men ought to have the same pleasure my husband gets when our sons reach for him or text him and say, Dad, will you help me with X, that mothers have traditionally had. That sense of being powerfully needed and powerfully important in the lives of those you love, and not simply for bringing home the wherewithal to support them, but for the emotional role that men play. Last point on this, I'm not saying it'll be the same. Men will parent differently, just as women parent differently, and again, individual men and individual women will be quite different. What I am saying is we should get to a place where a typical man and a woman ask about the division of labor between who's going to work more and who's going to care more, or are they going to do it equally, but then what trade-offs are they going to make, just as you would in a same-sex couple. If you were two men or two women, you'd have to ask, well, who's making more money? Who's more committed to their career? Who would rather be with the children? Or the parents? Who's a better caregiver? Who's more ambitious? Who's got a better boss? There are any number of questions. Right now, we ask those questions. We still have the default roles that, well, the man's supposed to be the breadwinner, and the woman's supposed to be the caregiver, but we can mix those up a little bit. We should be opening that up completely. All right, so last thing I said I would talk to you all about is collective action. And here's maybe a chance to talk a little bit about Sheryl Sandberg and Lean In, and to say, as I make very clear in the book, that I have enormous respect for what Sheryl Sandberg's accomplished. My book was simultaneously written up in women's magazines and nominated as Best Business Book this year. I think that's due largely to Sheryl Sandberg. I do not think 3 years ago a book like this would have been understood as a business book, and now it is. And I think Lean In gets a huge amount of credit for that. I will also say I've had at least 3 young women ask me for a raise, and when they do, I think they just read Lean In. And I think that's great. I don't always give them the raise, but I think absolutely, they should be raising their hand, they should be negotiating, they should be sitting at the table, they should be doing all of that. That is hugely important. It's just not enough. And it's not enough because you can't plan your life, or you can plan it, it just won't go according to plan. Lots of things will happen that you didn't anticipate, and you may well, as I did, hit a tipping point. But it also isn't enough because as much as we as Americans would like to believe we can do this one woman at a time, one company at a time, one sort of movement at a time, we can't. This is something we have to do as a society, as voters, as policymakers, as policy advocates. We have to decide that we are going to be a society that values care. And we have to start with plain family leave, with the idea that if your child gets sick, or your parent gets sick, or you get sick, or anything else happens, somebody dies, you have, whatever the crisis is, you can take time off and you will not lose your pay for that month, and you will not be at risk of losing your job. That, when we explain this to other audiences in other countries, they just don't believe it. And when you then tell them we don't even have paid maternity leave, we and Papua New Guinea, fabulous company. We and Papua New Guinea also, I think, has the highest rate of domestic violence in the world. At any rate, we and Papua New Guinea are the only countries that don't have paid maternity leave. And of course, all our peer countries have at least some measure of paternity leave. We have to have both. We're never going to get to equality in parenting unless fathers can be with their children as early and as long as mothers can. And we have to decide that as a society and pay for it. It's not that expensive. There are other societies that do it, and there are lots of other ways we can do it. But we do have to come together and endorse an entire policy agenda. You can do it from the right or from the left. Marco Rubio has a paid leave plan, just as Bernie Sanders does and Hillary Clinton does. But we can't keep assuming that individual corporations will do this, or individual cities, or individual states. We have to come together for an entire agenda of how we support care. We'll be better off as individuals. We'll be far better off as a society. So to get to real equality between men and women, full equality between men and women, and that is the goal, right? The goal is not just advancing women. The goal is full equality between men and women. We are going to have to value traditional women's work as much as we value traditional men's work. And I should add, and I didn't talk about this before, but that I've been talking about unpaid traditional women's work, but of course that also means nursing, teaching, coaching, therapy of all kinds, elder care of all kinds. We're going to have to pay for that kind of work. We're going to have to value it. We're going to have to professionalize it and value it not just in money, but in social prestige. So now I try very hard not to ask someone what they do. And if that subject comes up and someone says, I'm at home with my kids, I'm the lead parent, or says I'm a teacher or a nurse, I try very hard to think that work is as hard and as valuable as if that person said to me, I'm an advertising executive, I'm an investment banker, or any of the other things that we traditionally have learned to value. So we're going to have to value care. We're going to have the second half of the revolution, which means to liberate men as much as we've liberated women, and to value them for their caring side just as much as we value women for our competitive side, and to recognize all the differences that's likely to introduce. And to do this as a society, as voters, as citizens, not just one self-help book on how you manage your time better or how you balance work and family at the time. So when I give this talk, the most frequent response I get is, you're really optimistic. You're utopian, even. These are lovely dreams, but how on earth are we going to get there? And so I want to close by why I'm optimistic. Because when I was sitting here in 1977, I smoked a lot. Really, I still kind of miss it, but I won't go there. But I smoked a pack a day. I smoked in the student center. Everybody smoked. I think even 10 years ahead of me, people were still smoking up here. I think by the time I was a student, you could no longer smoke as a professor, but you sure could smoke anywhere else. My mother used to set out little vases of cigarettes at dinner parties in Virginia in the 1960s and 1970s. If you did that in New York today, you might get sued. And I don't smoke. I know few people who smoke. The people who do smoke no longer think it's cool. They wish they didn't. And they're acutely aware that they're inflicting costs on others and not just on themselves. And I'm not that old. That was 35 years ago. When I was sitting here, I did not know any gay people. I didn't. There certainly were gay men and lesbian women in my class. I know them now, but I didn't know them then, and they would never have dared to describe their sexual preferences in any way. In fact, one gay man had the courage to hang a banner outside his Princeton window, and it had caused a huge controversy, and it really was not safe. And even 5 years ago, most people would have said, gay marriage in all 50 states? Not a chance. Not a chance. When I was growing up, you couldn't have even imagined what that meant. You couldn't have even described it. And when I was sitting here in 1977, only a decade prior had the Supreme Court decided that laws in Virginia, my home state, that made it illegal for a black person to marry a white person were unconstitutional. Only a decade prior to when I was sitting here. The idea of an African-American president was unthinkable. I mean, Jesse Jackson ran, but nobody thought that that was serious, that could ever be. And yet, just look at the change we've made only in the last decade. But look also at where we are on civil rights and gay rights, and the ways in which we're gearing up, certainly on civil rights, for the next wave of the civil rights movement. Because we've made enormous progress, but we still have far to go. We've made unbelievable progress for women over the course of my lifetime. Extraordinary progress. So much so that when my 14-year-old was watching John Kerry at the 2012 Democratic Convention, John Kerry was speaking on television, and Alexander said, "Who is that?" And I said, "It's John Kerry, and if Obama's reelected, he may well be Secretary of State." And Alexander said, without missing a beat, "You mean a man can be Secretary of State?" And he totally meant it. I mean, he wasn't being funny. He just hadn't dawned on him. He knew Condi Rice had been Secretary of State and he'd met Hillary Clinton, so he thought, well, that's a big job that women do. So we've made enormous progress. We can do this too. This is the second half of the women's revolution, the women's movement. But it's got to be a movement in which women advance, we value care, we liberate men, and we become a society that supports the full range of human endeavor. Thank you very much.
So Anne Marie will graciously take questions. We do ask for students to ask questions
Yes,
first.
absolutely.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My name's Andrea Michelson. I'm a second-year master's student, and this is actually my field of public policy that I want to work in. And my question to you is, I agree that we can be optimistic about the cultural change. I'm more concerned about the future of work. We see that there's a bifurcation where more and more jobs that are, typical middle-class jobs are getting outsourced or becoming computerized, and instead you have people at the very, very top or people at the very, very bottom. And those are jobs where the human element cannot be replaced. It's either kind of care or it's too expensive to have a machine do it. Second of all, if we start valuing care, it's going to be expensive. And we have seen a stagnation of middle-class wages. So how will we even be able to afford the care that we need? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question. So let me, I'm going to start with the optimistic part and then talk about the really hard part. And some of this, your question gets at a much larger set of issues, but care has to be a big part of them. So here's the optimistic part. For high-end workers, at least for a while, 10 years, probably 15, the high-end on-demand economy is a godsend, because when I was teaching law, you went to a law firm, and when you had kids, if you didn't want to work 2,000 billable hours a year, you were mommy tracked, or you were out completely, and then there was no way to get back in. Now you can do high-end, really high-end on-demand law work, and high-end on-demand medical work, and high-end engineering work. And indeed, there are even platforms for rent a boss. So if you're a high-end executive, you can do projects to get, you can say, I will be the top executive on this project and I'll get it done. So part of the book argues, don't drop out, defer, keep your hand in, and then be ready to ramp back up when you're ready. Now you can do that, and men can do that too. So for the high end, I actually am very optimistic. Equally, on your point about care is expensive, one of the things we've presided over is a huge transfer of assets from children to older people. The AARP and all the sort of lobby for my generation is alive and well, and we are going to see increasing subsidy of elder care. We're going to see, I just this morning heard on NPR, a city in Minnesota that's becoming dementia friendly, right? And is doing, and that's, literally, they are saying that Alzheimer's is likely to double by 2050 or some kind of dementia. There's going to be more and more resources for professionalization of elder care and paying for it. And again, so the lobby is at least working in the right direction. And there is a huge market there, right? And this is a market, as you point out, that is much harder to automate. So in that sense, too, I think we're going to see entrepreneurs entering that market we're going to, for children, but particularly for elders. The hard part is exactly the sort of the overall hollowing out and the low-end flexibility. So the entire gig economy where you can make a living and it's flexible, but you cannot buy a house, you cannot educate your children, you can't have a middle-class life. That's a much bigger set of issues that essentially needs a new social contract in this country. New America has a next social contract initiative. Hillary Clinton's talking about a basic bargain, but effectively we have got to redo the bargain that we struck, however imperfectly, in the New Deal and then again in the Great Society. And that's going to have portable benefits. They're going to have to be prorated. And we're effectively, I think, going to have to approach some version of a guaranteed basic income, even though if no one's talking about it that way. And that's a much larger, I think, set of issues that are how the digital economy is changing our political and economic system. What I just hope is that we insist on the care issues as a core part of that.
My name is Ken Sofer. I'm a first-year MPA. Thank you very much for coming and giving this talk, and particularly talking about kind of how to bring men into this discussion a little bit more. You spoke a little bit about the negotiation that happens between two partners of kind of figure out who plays the lead parent role. Can you talk a little bit more about not just the initial negotiation, but kind of over the course of a relationship, how you kind of renegotiate as necessary and kind of reassess roles? Particularly how to get out of a sort of path dependency. I think with a lot of careers, there's a sort of, once you're in that track, it's hard to take a step back and then re-engage. So can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. So when you said about how you renegotiate, I was thinking hourly, daily, weekly, monthly. I mean, Andy and I went through every conceivable way of measuring who was doing what, with each of us firmly convinced that we were doing more than the other at all times. I think you're very right to ask about how to avoid the path dependence. And the reason paternity leave is so important is that when the woman has maternity leave, she learns how to handle the child. It's not like she knows; she figures it out by trial and error and reading or whatever else. And once she knows, I say in the book, it's like whoever does the taxes first in a marriage, right? That person will do it forevermore. And so it's very important to establish very early on that you're equally competent, whatever it takes, in terms of taking leave, sharing leave, whatever it is, you both have to be equally competent. And that's as important for the woman as it is for the man. Because otherwise, what also sets in is what I call female sexism, where we kind of assume, we women, we sort of know better. And it's critical. It was as important for me to see Andy was as competent as I was, as it was for him to know that. And then I think you just have to be asking about, okay, whose turn is it? And as Andy wrote, in this article, Why I Put My Wife's Career First, it typically doesn't work out in beautiful 5-year increments. Because you get a big job, and that leads to another big job. But it should be at least constantly self-conscious. If right now you've got a bigger job, if I don't take my time in the next 5 years, I will not be able to later, right? So I at least need a period here to credential myself so that if I then take less time out more, so you take your job, I can get back in later. So I think I have a lot of questions that I say young couples should ask each other, and they're very concrete, like, would you move for me if I got a better job? But I think most of it is continually having the conversation and having it in terms of, okay, it's not going to be equal year in, year out, and even 5 years in, year out. But as long as both of us are thinking about how to do this over a lifetime, we can get to a balance that we're both happy with.
Hi, my name is Julia Reed. I'm a first-year MPA student as well. I have a question about there is obviously a paucity of women at the top, but also not really ascending to higher level ranks. And specifically with regards to foreign policy, I also worked at the State Department when you were there in a position so much more junior, it seems almost embarrassing to say that. But when I was there, and sort of in my experience as someone who wants to work in foreign policy, I've definitely come up against this very clear kind of divide and bias against literally what's called hard foreign policy and hard national security issues and soft national security issues, soft foreign policy issues, and that there are very few women working in hard foreign policy issues and somewhat more women working in kind of development issues and softer foreign policy issues. And very much, even though working under both, in a Hillary Clinton State Department and in a John Kerry State Department, who's been very much an ally of women, getting this sense from the top that women's issues are important, but then getting the sense from the middle as someone who's trying to rise that I shouldn't spend too much time working on or focusing on or even like coming into close proximity with anything related to an issue where women are important or where development matters, because then I won't be taken seriously as a hard foreign policy person, and I won't really be able to aspire to ascend to ranks to be director of policy planning or and so on. So how do women, and I think that applies to many fields where women feel that in order to really rise to the ranks that they, once they're in the field, to sort of rise in the field, that they have to suppress any desire to seem overly forward on kind of women's rights issues. Can you speak a little bit to that? I'd particularly be interested in your views on vis-a-vis the State Department, but in general as well.
That's great. So before I plunge into which way to focus, that actually goes to your point again, that one of the things, for instance, you're going to have to allow, if you want women to rise in big political jobs, are things like job shares. So it's perfectly possible to have job shares. And after I left the State Department, 2 young women who were at the National Security Council both had young children. They really were working the same portfolio, and it would have been perfectly possible for them to share the job. Indeed, it would have been an advantage because somebody really would have been there. Everybody gets very uncomfortable with that, and I pushed for it. It didn't happen. Both of those women left, and that will continue to happen until we fundamentally change ways of working. To go back to your point as you were asking that. So, in answer to your question, this is where you have to be a realist and an optimist at the same time. The realist in me would say, absolutely, you need to get your hard credentials first. We are not yet at a point where I can say with any confidence, if you pursue, I'm not going to call them women's issues. I'm going to call them development issues, care issues, long-term invest in the foundations of society issues. Those issues that, if we did it properly, we would have less terrorism, we would have less violence, we would have better economies. They are the long-term. Let's call them long-termism and far-sightedness issues. But given that not everyone is as enlightened as that, I would say, if I were advising you to make your tours, I'd say, yeah, let's get you some hard security and make sure you've got that under your belt, and then you can broaden. And I always point out that Hillary Clinton was the 3rd woman Secretary of State. She was the 1st woman Secretary of State who dared make women's issues a major priority. And I don't blame Madeleine Albright or Condi Rice one bit. If I'd been Madeleine Albright, no way. She was tougher than Colin Powell, and she had to be. And Condi Rice similarly. So I would still say be realistic about the power structure as it is. But I think I would say now what I wouldn't have said 5 years ago, which is you can afford to spend probably a third to 40% of your time on those longer term, important, invest in society issues. Thank you. You're welcome. Somebody here.
Hi, my name's Deanna. I'm a senior in the politics department. Thank you for coming today. You've laid out a wonderful agenda about how we can catch up with the rest of the world on these issues. And I'm really curious as to why we are still at the bottom. What is specific about our historical and cultural development that seemingly everyone else has gotten the message and we are still behind? And what is different about their historical and cultural development that they seem to have gotten this message?
Wow. It's hard for me to know where to start. I'm half Belgian, and certainly, you look at the European countries and you look at the Nordic countries in particular, and the Nordic countries are very competitive economies, and yet they've understood that investing in care is essential to being a competitive economy. Maybe the best simple response is the polarization of our politics since the 1970s. So in 1971, a bill for universal childcare passed both houses of Congress with a bipartisan majority, something that is so unthinkable now. And Richard Nixon vetoed it, and he vetoed it because that was the sort of first wave of the backlash of the religious right of a kind of, this is taking women out of the home and denaturing them so that they are not going to be valued as caregivers. And since then, that set of issues, certainly around childcare, has been politicized that way, in a way that I think is reasonably unique to American politics, or more virulent in American politics. You certainly see it in other countries, but most of them are parliamentary countries, and so it doesn't have the same sort of all or nothing impact. There are deeper questions about American individualism. One of the things that I think is interesting is that as we become majority minority, which we are already becoming, all the cultures we are becoming, all of them, every East Asian, South Asian, Arab, Latino, you name it, all of them place greater value on family than WASPs do, right? I mean, it's just, and who knows why that's true, but if you look at sort of extended family groupings and emphasizing support for family, you see that in others. There are many other explanations, and I won't pontificate, particularly in a university that has people that have far more nuanced explanations, but I think those two things are part of it. The nature of our sort of majority dominant culture and our particular polarized politics. But I also think we can change it.
I wanted to go back to one of the questions earlier around that conversation between two partners about
Yes.
who's the stay-at-home role and who goes out to work. And one of the questions that you who earns the most.
Yes.
And it feels that particularly for lower income households, that's going to be the determining factor, and it's no longer a choice anymore. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about how the wage gap feeds into your manifesto and how we avoid being trapped in a circular place where women stay at home because they earn less and they earn less because they stay at home.
Yes. Thanks. So it depends where you are, because if you just look at the wage gap, that's certainly what you'd think. And the wage gap, of course, is much greater for mothers than it is for women who don't have caregiving responsibilities, are somewhere between 92 and 96% on the dollar. Mothers are around 72% on the dollar. So on the one hand, you would say, yeah, that would lock women in. On the other hand, women are doing better. They're getting more education. They're doing better coming out of high school. There are many more women in college, and that's more true the less elite institutions that you look at. Women are, and there are more jobs now. If you think about the decline of the manufacturing economy and the rise of the service economy, certainly in healthcare and education, those jobs are more likely to be women's jobs. So if you look at the jobs where they're the greatest growth opportunities, they are much more traditionally female jobs than traditionally male jobs. Which is to say that I don't think it cuts that way in many, many families. I think there's a group of middle class Americans where you have a two-career couple where that's still true. But I think in the lower middle class and certainly working class, that's not true. If anything, she's more likely to be working. And so the question then is there a way, so this goes to your question, can she work? Can he be lead parent? Not stay-at-home dad, can he be lead parent? Can he be valued for that in a way that then actually supports her and lets her rise? So I don't want to say that's not true in some of the cases, but when you break down the data in terms of the different groups, I actually think over the longer term that's favoring women.
Hi, I'm Marnie. I'm a junior in the politics department, and sort of along the same lines of sort of a vicious cycle. You talked about your optimism and why you're optimistic, but not necessarily how that change is necessarily going to happen. And one of the things that sort of I see is it seems to take cultural change to create policy changes like paid family leave, for example. The culture needs to start valuing care more to do that, and at the same time, it takes policy often to create many of these cultural changes in the long term. And I was just wondering how you see us, in this case, breaking into this cycle in order to create real change.
Thank you. So the chicken and the egg problem, right? It takes political change and cultural change and economic change, and they all have to happen together. So a couple of reasons why I'm optimistic, again, more specifically. One is your generation, right? Again, I think I've succeeded when an audience like this is equally men and women, or let's say 60-40 at least, where the people I'm talking to are young men and women who are figuring out how they're going to put careers and families together, not women who are trying to figure out how to do it, men and women together. And I do think many of the men in your generation at least want to ask those questions. I then think, cynically, the more men that are in these positions, the more we will pay attention to them. When men are primary caregivers and are asking for paternity leave, when men are saying, excuse me, the fact that I worked part-time does not mean I should have been knocked off leadership position, when men are in Congress thinking about their sons and as well as their daughters, we're going to pay more attention to those issues. Part of my point is, as long as we define this as a women's issue, we will never get to equality, right? It is an issue for parents or for caregivers of any kind. And I think you are also starting to see that in workplaces where men are starting to insist that, wait a minute, I should get that as well. And then I guess the last thing I'd say is I do think this is becoming a middle class issue and an economic issue. So if you look at Hillary Clinton, you look at Bernie Sanders, you look at Marco Rubio again, and those are the three platforms I've looked at the most, they're not selling this as a women's issue. They are saying working families can't survive. And I talk about building an infrastructure of care, or you talk about elder care, but that's, again, gives me much more hope politically than I don't see the U.S. having a women's party, and I don't see the U.S. doing this as a women's issue, but I think the more we make this a middle class issue and a millennial issue and a care issue, the more likely the culture and political change will happen.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Emitha. I was going to say I'm a research assistant, but apropos of your discussion earlier about what do you do, I feel like I should say, I like jazz or something. But
and isn't that more interesting?
I really appreciate your call for systemic change because I think it really helps shift the burden away from individual women that it wasn't their fault, that this was hard. But I do wonder if you were 22 or just graduated today in 2015, what are one or two things you might say to yourself now that aren't necessarily immediately apparent to help make things easier?
So if I were speaking to my younger self, so many things I would say, but so the thing I think I wish I'd known, and this actually goes to the earlier question as well, is I would tell myself that I cannot have a changed view of my own role, but still cling to a traditional view of my husband's role. And this is very tricky stuff because we as women want to have everything men have, but the romance of the guy who earns more than we do and is smarter than we are and knows what to do is strong. And I certainly felt when I was where you are that I certainly thought I needed a guy who was as smart as I do. I still think that, absolutely. But I would have thought more than that. I still had that idea that he had to kind of be one up from me. And I would now say, that wasn't going to work. Two people, marrying somebody just like me didn't work. I can tell you that. More fundamentally, that I need to tackle those stereotypes of men, which are deeply embedded for we women, in the same way that they're embedded for men, as much as I was very good at tackling the stereotypes about women. I was not so good about tackling the stereotypes about men. And I think those are conversations women need to have among ourselves and with the men in our lives and more broadly, and learn to say, wait a minute, if I want to be the person who's just like going like this, well, and I want a family too, then how's that going to work?
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I come from a unique perspective in this conversation in that I graduated from a women's college.
Yeah.
And where this issue is a really big, prevalent topic of discussion. And so even in my education, I found that we had an education program where women would study to become teachers. And even then, people look down on, women who are trying to maybe get an education to become a teacher. And people are like, why are you wasting your time when you can do this somewhere else? And so I just wanted to ask you your perspective about the role of administrators in higher education in your discussions about policy.
Yeah. I'm so glad you asked that question. I write in the book about watching my Princeton roommate, actually, and still one of my dearest friends in the world, teach first grade at a New York school. And I was a newly minted Harvard law professor, and I was very proud of my status as a new law professor. And I sat there watching her teach these kids. And the first thing that struck me was it was a whole lot harder than teaching first-year law students, right? I mean, my students sat in their desks and pretty much did what I wanted them to, or hers didn't. But I found myself thinking, if I fail, my students don't learn civil procedure. It will not blight their lives forever. If she fails, those kids won't learn to read or won't learn to read at grade level. And that really will affect them for the rest of their lives. And at the time, I kind of brushed it off and thought, well, okay, yeah, but she's teaching first grade and I'm teaching law school, and one is clearly more important than the other. Now I really do think, not that what I do isn't important, I do think it was important to teach law professors, but I now think, from the point of view of a society, really knowing how to teach kids how to read takes every bit as much education and training and thinking and preparation as standing up and teaching civil procedure. And so I honestly, and other societies have gotten there, right? I mean, in Finland, the top kids who come out of schools like this one go into teaching. We can do this. We simply have got to, again, consciously deprogram ourselves from this notion that it's like milk and cookies and you show them a few phonetics and, oh boy, they learn how to read. That's just not what it's about. And all the more, given all the different ways we know about learning. And again, given that that is where the inequality gap starts, right? So the quality teaching all the way through is part of closing the inequality gap that plagues everything we do. But I agree, it's going to take some really hard work.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Megan Campbell. I'm an MPA too, and thank you very much for this. My question is about mentoring, and in particular, mentoring across the gender divide. So you mentioned that mentors were important to you, in particular male mentors, and in my career before I came here, I was very lucky to have been mentored by two CEOs who were both extremely typically man, competitive, go out, win, win, win types of guys, and they had no idea how to mentor me.
Right.
No idea. They felt completely out of their element, and they acknowledged that, and they got better at it. And in some ways, it was very useful to me in that by having to meet them halfway, it sort of tapped me into much more of my competitive side than the caring side that I had sort of relied on before that. And that's given me flexibility as a manager. But I find that for myself, when I'm now managing someone or mentoring someone, I tend to sort of meet them on the plane they're on. So competitive for the competitive people and caring for the caring people. And I don't know that I very successfully help people bring those two together. So I'm curious what you've seen in terms of practices of people, of women who are very good at mentoring men, of men who are very good at mentoring women, or people who are good at, just in general, at sort of helping people bring both the competitive and the caring side together.
I've never thought about that exactly, although it's true. I was mentored by men, and fortunately men who did not think I was going to cry. And so were tough on me.
I cried.
What?
I cried. They were still tough on me, though.
But were sufficiently tough so that I toughened up. And that is important, right? One of the things we know is that if women never get mentored the way men get mentored, then they're not ready. Then when the head of the lab or the head of the course yells at them and they dissolve, that is no good, right? You absolutely have got to be able to take it. And so I would certainly argue, whether I was mentoring a man or a woman, for being tough, for teaching them how to take criticism and understand, that's the way it is. And if you have to cry, well, you cry, but you keep going through your tears. You just, so I think that is very important. What I now do that I never did before is have conversations with all the men I mentor about how they plan to fit work and family together. And that is the biggest change, is that I now say, this isn't sort of their style of working. This is more, have you thought about how you're going to do this? Because this is going to be hard and you need to think about it. I think it is true that I would now challenge an all hard narrative the way I would have challenged an all soft narrative. I mean, back to the earlier question, I don't like hard and soft for the obvious reasons that we privilege hard over soft. But I think I would say to someone, have you thought that you would actually get much further if you were managing this person? If you tried a little empathy, if you tried thinking in a more collaborative vein. So I think I haven't thought about this exactly in the way I mentor there, but I would argue, again, all of us have both sides. All of us have different combinations of both sides, and the most successful people are the people who tap into both. Which sounds like the right note on which to end.